Hey guys, what's up? I am trying out a new series here where I just talk about movies that have really kept me engaged during quarantine. These movies specifically have helped a lot. We can't go to the theater, there's very little new content, and honestly, the new content we get, I'm not crazy about generally. So, there have been movies that I've just been rewatching or watching for the first time that I just feel like really engaged me right now in a time when obviously current events are on everyone's minds. These movies uh, really captured my imagination, and I would like to recommend all of these. And the first one that I'll be starting with is the 2000 film, The Assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford. Yes, that's the full title. It stars Brad Pitt as the titular Jesse James and Casey Affleck, making, I think, what was his breakthrough role as the titular coward, Robert Ford. Based on true events, obviously, on the real murder of Jesse James, the notorious outlaw. There have been many films about Jesse James, and more so than that, he's just a mythic figure by this point. No name is as synonymous with the Old West than that of Jesse James. He was an outlaw who was said to have been a real life Robin Hood. He stole from the rich and gave to the poor. His, marksman skills were legendary. He started his life of crime and guerrilla warfare at the age of 16. And that's the thing, before he was an outlaw, like a bandit, he was a guerrilla Confederate fighter. He fought for the Confederacy, and that's said to have motivated his political or his criminal life. He was motivated politically. That was part of the legend, is that he was striking back against the Union, um, who crushed the Confederacy and imposed its tyrannical will upon the rebels of the South. That's the legend of Jesse James. In a modern sense, that legend is pretty immediately um, hard to accept. Obviously, we have a very different view of the Confederacy now, and promoting a figure who is dedicated to the preservation of slavery, that's hard. And Jesse James is not the cultural figure he once was, but even outside of Confederate politics, there's that whole myth that he stole from the rich and gave to the poor. And that's what really earned him the love and respect of people across the nation. He was a folk hero. He was also a murderer. He was a criminal who killed innocent people, brutalized innocent people, and never actually gave to the poor. He never actually shared his wealth to anyone outside of his immediate circle. That's the legend of Jesse James. The real man was infinitely complicated, infinitely complex by even the most characteristic analysis of his character. And that is precisely what the movie The Assassination of Jesse James is about. It is about the deconstruction of a myth and the deconstruction of a story that has become ingrained in our culture. Because the assassination of Jesse James is historic. It's relevant. It is it is again a part of American mythos. The story goes that Jesse James was betrayed by a cowardly member of his gang, Robert Ford, who shot him in the back of the head while Jesse James was hanging up a painting. The facts of that are true, but this movie makes a point to show that the truth behind that story is far more complicated emotionally, and the dynamic between Jesse James and Robert Ford is more complex than that story would imply. Now, according to Jesse James' um, his own, what's the opposite of an ancestor? Uh, the descendants of Jesse James. According to them, this is the most accurate depiction of their ancestor that they've ever seen in media. And this movie has just a tone of authenticity. It has a quiet, humble tone that really conveys, I think, the nuance of the actual subject matter. Right? This is not the grand old west shown in John Ford movies or Howard Hawks movies. But neither is it the anti-hero kind of revisionist western of Clint Eastwood movies. This is a very nuanced depiction of both the characters and the setting. The production value, the costumes, and the performances really feel like you have been transported to the past, to the time period. That to me is one of the greatest gifts that cinema can give us. And already it's enticing on that front, but it invites you into a world, and because it's done so effectively, you don't mind the 3 hour running time. At least I didn't. But the star of this film, the two stars, I should say, are Brad Pitt and Casey Affleck in their respective roles. I've never seen Jesse James depicted on film before. Um, I know he's always been depicted gloriously. He's always been, you know, put on a pedestal in his portrayals. Brad Pitt shows one of his most solemn, despaired, and quiet performances. I mean, this is a man who has proven himself now, right? But Brad Pitt transitioning from star to cinema art house hero, right? It's an amazing transition to watch. And this is the perfect balance for that. Jesse James has the flair. Jesse James has the gravitas. Jesse James is an icon. It makes perfect sense for Brad Pitt to play this character, especially when the role calls for that charm that Brad Pitt is known to have. But Brad Pitt has a chance here to show his own depth as a performer. Because Jesse James is not a hero, he's not a villain, he is a tormented figure. He is a tormented soul who has been alienated by his paranoia. He can't trust anyone. He's been living in war since he was 16 years old. He's known nothing but bloodshed. And while this is not exactly a sympathetic performance in that you come away believing Jesse James to be the hero or the victim, it does capture, I think, a mentality common amongst criminals. He does capture that outlaw sense in a very tragic fashion. No one's going to say that Jesse James was the hero of this story. And for good reason. The man's brutal. The man is vicious. In some ways, he is inhuman. I mean, Brad Pitt, you can't see it very well in this photo, but Brad Pitt in this movie looks like the goddamn devil. All right. Oh my God, that shot. Yeah, we need to talk about the cinematography at some point, but Brad Pitt is a sinister force in this movie. But you understand why. You understand the pain that Jesse James has gone through. And you understand how his celebrity stature led him to that point. People idolize him. Immediately when he meets Robert Ford knows everything about him. Robert Ford has been fanboying over Jesse James, since the beginning of his outlaw career. We know what that kind of adoration does to celebrities who are not notorious outlaws. It removes them from the real world. It insulates them from society. puts them in this bubble, right? I mean, that's why you see so many celebrities who are arrogant, right? Even if they're not ill-intentioned people, they just how could you be the same person after all of the country worships you openly? Combine that celebrity with Jesse James' sense of vengeance and his bitterness, and you have a perfect understanding of this man. At least I did. And that's not to say that Brad Pitt does not have Jesse James, or that he doesn't portray Jesse James to not have charisma, not have charm. You can understand why people buy into the myth. You see it. I mean, he's a very imposing figure. I mean, that's putting it lightly, right? But what this movie allows us to see is the man behind that myth that gets presented so often. But even more so than Brad Pitt, man, we need to talk about Casey Affleck. We need to talk about Casey Affleck in this movie. Robert Ford is not a celebrity. He's a name. People know him. People have strong feelings about him, especially back at the time, right? But he's not a celebrity. There's no god stature for Robert Ford. Even though he is a part of mythology, he's not a myth. He's just a part of a myth. And the dynamic between Jesse James, the flawed man who became a hero, to Robert Ford, the flawed man who became a villain, really reveals how we twist things. We twist stories. We don't see the nuance until it's too late. Because Robert Ford is not just a coward. Robert Ford, just like Jesse James, was an extremely complicated man with tragic flaws. He wanted what everyone else wanted. He wanted to ride with the James brothers. That's the other thing. Sam Shepard has a really great but small part as Jesse's older brother, Frank. But Robert Ford wanted what most people wanted. And he got closer than a lot of them did. Robert Ford was a troubled young man, confused, who got to meet his idol. And when they say don't meet your heroes, they're not even talking about Jesse James. Jesse James is the wrong man to look up to, and an even worse man to get entangled with. Jesse senses Robert's shaky nature, his kind of shaky admiration for him. But, oh God, Casey Affleck's voice in this movie, it is always cracking against his own will. And that just perfectly shows the pathetic nature of this character. Just the weakness trying to be strong. Weakness trying to project not just strength, not courage, but power. That's what he wants from Jesse James. He wants Jesse's power. He wants the love. He's not after glory in the Confederate sense. At one point in the movie, he says, "All my life I've been nobody. Jesse James has been as big as a tree." And when he meets Jesse James, and when he opens up to Jesse James, and Jesse rejects him, there's a great scene, a pivotal moment for Robert Ford's character, where he talks to Jesse James and he says, I've noticed we have similarities. You're the youngest of your family. I'm the youngest of mine. Your father was a minister. My father was a minister, right? All these little trivial things, really, trivial connections that don't mean that Robert and Jesse are truly alike or have truly shared the same journey. But to Robert, that's as close as he could get to his hero. And Jesse James laughs at him. He rejects that. He rejects the very notion that one day Robert Ford could be the next Jesse James. And because Robert was chasing glory and didn't have sincere admiration for the real man, because he also learns that the real man isn't like the guy he read about in the dime store novels, right? Once he sees the man behind that story and legend, he says, I'll create my own legend. I'll take this gun in my hand and I will create my own story. They will talk about me. I will be the man who killed Jesse James. And Robert got exactly what he asked for. He became one of the most notorious figures of his time. One could argue there was not a more hated man in America than Robert Ford. For one thing, and the movie shows this wonderfully, after Jesse's assassination, Robert Ford would reenact the murder publicly for an audience. He continued to profit off of Jesse's name like years afterwards. That sounds disgusting to us, but the movie presents it as if Robert really didn't know what other choice he had. What choice did he really have? He had his claim to fame, right? He was the man who killed Jesse James, and it bought him that notoriety. And as so many modern celebrities learn, that fame comes with a price. Especially, okay, we'll talk about the other aspects of the movie, I promise, because we need to talk about the cinematography. But what this movie says about celebrity culture, right? The comparison between these two men. Jesse James, for as vile as his actions were, and for as kind of mythologized as he made a long career building up his reputation. He made a long, measured, and very strategic career to build that myth. That took time, effort, and dedication. Robert Ford wanted it fast, and he did not have the patience to take the long road. I think when people rush to claim fame to the point where they're willing to do anything, even when killing a notorious outlaw, that is fame that has not truly been earned, and that is fame that can easily imprison you. Because once you're the man who killed Jesse James, what else can you be? What else can you do with your life? The shadow of Jesse James hung over Robert Ford's life until Robert Ford was murdered himself at the age of 30. And by the way, the man who murdered Robert Ford was eventually released on a pardon because there were so many petitions for this man's release. Imagine being that hated. It's a curse, and Casey Affleck plays it beautifully. He's a snake, but just like with Jesse James, who is a monster, you can't condone him. I'm sorry, you can't condemn him or condone. You can't pass judgment on him because you see his story progress in such beautifully detailed fashion. You see him at his most vulnerable. You see his attempts to, actually do the right thing. He does try to, well, when I say the right thing, he does make sincere attempts at becoming close to Jesse James. He makes sincere attempts to become part of the James gang. But he just can't win the respect. And why could he? Jesse James doesn't respect anybody but himself. By that point, he's paranoid and delusional. So, cannot recommend, or I cannot praise these performances enough, right? And there are so many other great performances. Sam Rockwell plays Robert Ford's brother, Charlie. Charlie is in between. He is afraid of Jesse James, and he's certainly no hero, right? He's certainly no dashing figure. But he has more integrity, you could say, than his brother does. If not integrity, just at least, he's willing to stand up to Jesse James, even in the most mild of ways. At one point, Jesse reveals that he had to kill a friend of theirs, a friend of Charlie's. And Sam Rockwell says, "Well, I'm a little mad at you, if you want to know the God's honest truth." But you have also Jeremy Renner, you have Mary Louise Parker, you have a great cast in this movie. Um, Even Zoe Deschanel appears like really briefly. She must not have been famous yet, but it was really interesting to see so many people who were not famous yet. I think Brad Pitt at the time of this movie was the only celebrity. Obviously, Casey Affleck is a brother to Ben Affleck, and I imagine he got some. I think he was in Good Will Hunting, so it's not like he had nothing to his name and no reason. Oh, that's so interesting. Casey Affleck was the younger brother to a much more popular person. That is really interesting, actually. I wonder if he drew on that for his performance. But anyways, but man, we have to talk about the cinematography. Like that shot right there. Like the halo effect, him standing in that field, like he's practically a silhouette. There's so much poetry in the visual language of this film. I mean, honestly, the high point for uh, Roger Deakins' career might be the train robbery scene. You see a shot of it there. When the train like cuts through, like there's this great shot. It's like a panning shot. The train is coming through. It's the middle of the night. The screen is pitch black, and then you just see that light coming around the corner. It is so the contrast between the headlight and the darkness. That's like a masterwork right there. And I mean, talk about every frame of painting. It's a it's a visually profound film, and it definitely draws a lot of comparison between filmmakers like Terrence Malick, for example. Terrence Malick has a lot of cinematography like that. The beautiful landscape shots. But this is different than Terrence Malick in a few ways. Most of all, with Terrence Malick, not that his characters are insignificant, but I feel like the characters revolve around the landscape. You know what I mean? I feel like the characters are there to add to this, not add to the scenery, but add to the atmosphere. The films are not about Terrence Malick's characters. You know what I mean? At least with very rare exception. Because A Hidden Life, his most recent one, was more character driven. But with this movie, it's kind of the opposite. The atmosphere is there to enhance the characters' internal journeys, their conflicts, right? And their arcs. So, whereas the characters are there to enhance the atmosphere and the landscapes of a Terrence Malick movie, this one has the cinematography, the landscapes revolve around the characters. It's a very character driven movie, and because of that, I don't mind the length. Even when a lot of plot stuff isn't happening, I just feel like every scene reveals something about the character. You see the character in a in a just more dimension gets added to the characters as the movie progresses. Is what I'm trying to say. Like, and it's never through like long like backstory exposition or anything like that. It's just seeing the way they interact in certain situations. Um, the director of this movie, I don't know what he's done as of late, but before this, he did a movie called Chopper, based on another real killer, um, another real criminal. Yeah, and that stars a young Eric Bana. Now, I don't think American audiences think much of Eric Bana. I think his biggest exposure to them is that Hulk movie. Didn't help his reputation a lot, as I understand. But watching this movie, it's like, holy shit, this guy's actually brilliant. Like, there's a brilliant Eric Bana performance. I never really noticed him before. So that's a whole different discussion because I think Chopper is also brilliant for very similar reasons. It wasn't as popular here because Chopper Reed is an Australian legend, not an American one. But please watch that if you have not. So, just for context, too, right? This movie came out in 2007, the same year as There Will Be Blood and No Country for Old Men. I really wish this had won some Oscars, but it's not a case where you can say, oh, it just went to the wrong movie. Like, you can't get mad that No Country for Old Men swept. Like, you can't get mad about that. But I'm glad that Jesse James has gotten its recognition. Brad Pitt says that it's like his favorite movie of his own. I think he produced it too, and now he's produced a lot of movies, but that might have been his first. So it's a very important movie to him. Casey Affleck got a nomination for Best Supporting Actor. Now, of course, he's an Academy Award winner. Not gonna lie, I think that is his most Oscar-worthy performance. Problem is, came out at the same year as Javier Bardem as Anton Chigurh, right? In No Country. Again, can't really say it went to the wrong guy. Like, how mad can I get that Javier Bardem won? I really can't. No matter how much I love Casey Affleck in this role. But unfortunately, because of the movie's running time, Jesse James didn't even make back half its budget, which is unfortunate. Its reputation has survived. It's definitely a cult movie, and people who love it, people who see it love it. And I think that if you love very meditative movies, if you love very period accurate movies, or if you just love movies with a compelling story, yeah, check it out. It's probably more compelling if you already know who Jesse James is. Like, knowing his background as a Confederate guerrilla fighter kind of added more to his character for me. And they don't go into it that too much with the film, so I would also say that. But yeah, again, highly recommended. Also, Chopper is recommended, so go watch both, but watch Jesse James first.